Let's go back live at the UN headquarters for the meeting on how they discuss the necessity of ending the blockade against Cuba.
Mr. President, I wish to begin by recognizing and welcoming the presence of Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba, Mr. Bruno Rodriguez Parrilla, and to convey the warm wishes of friendship and solidarity of the South African people to him and the people of Cuba. Mr. President, the South African delegation aligns itself with a statement made by Chad on behalf of the African Group, Iraq on behalf of the G77 and China, and Uganda on behalf of the non-aligned movement. Mr. President, in adopting UN General Assembly Resolution 787 entitled "The Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial and Financial Embargo Imposed by the United States of America against Cuba" on 2 November last year, South Africa joined 187 states voting in favor of the resolution put forward each year against the US embargo. South Africa is steadfast in its unwavering support, together with the majority of the international community, in voting in favor of lifting the United States embargo. Mr. President, the United States designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism and the enforcement of Title III of the Helms-Burton Act further entrenches this embargo. South Africa also stands steadfast in its support for the removal of Cuba from the list of countries designated by the United States as a state sponsor of terrorism. Mr. President, South Africa is extremely concerned by the damaging impact that the United States economic, commercial, and financial embargo against Cuba has on the livelihoods of the Cuban people, especially the poor and vulnerable. South Africa reiterates its unwavering call to the United States to remove this unjust burden of sanctions and to opt for constructive dialogue with Cuba and not to inflict further harm on vulnerable Cuban citizens. South Africa's trade with Cuba is hampered by the US embargo and the extraterritorial application of the sanctions on third countries. The US embargo raises the legal, economic, financial, and commercial risks in doing business with Cuba. Its extraterritorial application remains a major constraint to the strengthening of bilateral trade relations. The embargo remains a major impediment for South African companies in conducting business with Cuba. Nevertheless, relations between South Africa and Cuba continue to serve as an exemplary model of South-South cooperation. South Africa has strengthened its bilateral cooperation programs with Cuba, as well as pursuing new areas of cooperation, such as infrastructure development, agriculture, education, and science and innovation. Mr. President, the United States embargo is the most significant obstacle for Cuba in its quest to realize its development objectives, including the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The shortages of all basic products exacerbated by the US embargo has resulted in near hyperinflation levels, especially in the food sector, where scarcity is driving prices outside of the reach of most Cubans, and particularly those who cannot rely on remittance payments. Large-scale fuel price increases in Cuba further contribute to food and other price increases, which amplify the harm inflicted by the US embargo on the Cuban population. Mr. President, the Cuban government relies on tourism and the provision of professional skills as key drivers of the economy. Cuba deploys many doctors as part of exchange programs and has an emerging pharmaceutical and biotechnology industry. The US embargo, however, continues to prevent the full potential of these sectors to be exploited, leading to hundreds of millions of dollars in potential revenue losses. Mr. President, South Africa commends the countries that have taken measures to mitigate the specific effects of the Helms-Burton Act and to request third-party countries to support Cuba and its people by scrapping any domestic laws or regulations that continue to hamper the development of Cuba and its people. The same appeal is made towards removing Cuba from the US list, designating the country as a state sponsor of terrorism. The implementation of the UN 2030 agenda remains at risk when the embargo prevents a member state from fairly participating in its own socio-economic development. My delegation will therefore vote in favor of the resolution before us, as it has done before. In closing, Mr. President, South Africa appeals once again to the international community to renew its efforts to promote constructive and transparent dialogue between Cuba and the United States, both bilaterally and through the appropriate United Nations structures, with a view to achieving the objectives of all the resolutions already adopted by the United Nations in this regard, and to ensure the sustainable further progress of the people of Cuba. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of South Africa for their statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished permanent representative of China.
Mr. President, China associates itself with the statements made by Iraq on behalf of the Group of 77 and China, and by Eritrea on behalf of the Group of Friends in defense of the Charter of the United Nations. In today's world characterized by upheaval, frequent wars, and development imbalances, developing countries are facing great difficulties in implementing the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. At the recent General Debate of the General Assembly and the Summit of the Future, leaders have called on the international community to work together to address the current crisis and challenges and build a future of shared prosperity. However, the United States and a few other Western countries are still pursuing unilateralism, protectionism, and bullying. They resort to abusive use of illegal unilateral sanctions against countries such as Cuba, which gravely violate the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, seriously undermine the international consensus on the 2030 Agenda, jeopardize the rights to survival and development of the countries concerned and their people. Such conduct runs counter to the true spirit of multilateralism and is incompatible with the trend of times, namely peaceful development and win-win cooperation. Facts have proved that sanctions and embargoes cannot crush the people of other countries, and containment and suppression cannot solve one's own predicament. Since 1992, for 31 consecutive years, the GA has adopted by an overwhelming majority a resolution on the necessity of ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. It urges all states to comply with the UN Charter and the norms of international law and repeal or invalidate all laws and measures of any kind with extraterritorial effects that affect the sovereignty of other states, the legitimate interests of entities or persons under their jurisdiction, and the freedom of trade and navigation. This is a just call from the international community that must be implemented immediately and effectively. It is outrageous that the United States, instead of ending its sanctions against Cuba, has doubled down by placing Cuba on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. The embargo imposed by the U.S. against Cuba for over 6 decades has cost the latter hundreds of billions of dollars in damage and triggered a serious humanitarian disaster. Such hegemonic acts will certainly be condemned by the international community with one voice. China has always practiced genuine multilateralism, firmly upholds international justice, supports countries in choosing their own path of development in line with their national conditions. We unequivocally oppose hegemonism and power politics. China once again strongly urges the U.S., in accordance with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and the basic norms of international law, to immediately and fully lift the blockade and sanctions on Cuba and remove Cuba from the list of state sponsors of terrorism. China and Cuba are good friends, good comrades, and good brothers. China highly appreciates the efforts of Cuba to maintain a just and reasonable international order and promote global solidarity and cooperation. We feel for Cuba as it is currently experiencing difficulties. We will continue to help Cuba to the best of our ability. We will firmly support the government and people of Cuba in overcoming their difficulties at an early date so as to realize the development and revitalization of their country. China will once again vote in favor of the draft resolution submitted by Cuba under this agenda item. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished permanent representative of China for his statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished permanent representative of Guyana.
We continue to listen to some of the statements at the plenary session of the UN and how they debate on the necessity of ending the U.S. blockade, and they explain all the harsh difficulties that it generates, that this policy generates on the Cuban people and its development for the welfare of the Cuban people and to also achieve the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals.